Thank you to my colleague from Illinois, from Nevada, and other senators who are out here to fight for the right for women to have basic health care services in this country. You know, I have said before that Republican attacks on reproductive freedom would never stop with Roe. They would never stop with abortion. I have said before IVF was at risk, and now it has been so heartbreaking to see that warning become a gut-wrenching reality for women in Alabama. And it is absolutely infuriating to see some of the same Republicans who support so-called fetal personhood bills, who want to codify the very ideology in the Alabama Supreme Court decision that ripped away access to IVF care, suddenly acting surprised, suddenly acting like they had no idea this would happen, suddenly acting like this was totally unforeseen, when it is exactly what we have been warning about and exactly what the far right has been working towards for decades. This isn't some surprise. The Alabama Supreme Court decision is Republican ideology in action. So spare me the empty statements, especially after the objection that we just saw here, unless you're actually going to work with us to protect IVF. Save your breath. There are women in Alabama who desperately want to start a family, women who have tried for years to get pregnant, women who have gone through the heartbreak of miscarriage, women who are battling cancer and other devastating diagnoses, for whom IVF is the only way they will be able to have children. And now, after everything they've been through, the hope, the disappointment, the thousands, the even tens of thousands of dollars it can cost to pursue IVF, after all that, these women have had their dreams shattered because Republicans believe a frozen embryo kept in storage at an IVF clinic is the same and should have the exact same rights as a living, breathing human person. That's not hyperbole. That is not hypothetical. That is what is happening. You don't have to imagine how painful this is. You just have to listen to the women in Alabama who have had their worlds turned upside down now by this decision. Megan Cole has a rare blood disease, prevents her from carrying children. Her hopes of starting a family through IVF and a surrogate were dashed last week when her doctor called to cancel her Friday appointment. She asked about transferring the embryos out of state. Even that door has been slammed shut to her. Jasmine York turned to IVF after previous ectopic pregnancies left her with no other options to have a baby. Now Alabama has left her with no options at all. As she said, it's completely just derailed a lot of hope. Kyla Lee spent 9 years and $80,000 trying to have a child. She's gone through several miscarriages, and she was days away from getting a viable embryo transferred. But instead of getting that embryo transplanted, she got the same heartbreaking phone call. Her hopes of a family were being put on hold. Years of trying, tens of thousands of dollars, and at the last moment, Republicans pulled the rug out from under her. Even families who already have gone through IVF are facing the fallout. Can they afford to pay and store unused embryos indefinitely? Can they be prosecuted if they don't? They don't know. Right now, no one knows. The anger, Madam President, the anguish, the stories of these women are heartbreaking. As IVF patient Kelly Belmont put it, quote, "We've already invested so much time and money and just physical and emotional anguish into this process, and to think that it could have all been for nothing and that we could be ending our journey to be able to have children is absolutely terrifying. I'm just trying to hold myself together emotionally," unquote. So powerful. I don't know how anyone can listen to these stories and still think politicians should be making women's healthcare decisions for them. I really don't. Now, I said earlier, Republicans are acting surprised now by the result of the very policies they've pushed for. They can save their breath. That's because actions speak louder than words. And many of the same Republicans saying they care now about IVF are literally, right now, co-sponsors of legislation that would enshrine fetal personhood into law and make IVF unavailable nationwide. You cannot support IVF and support fetal personhood laws. They are fundamentally incompatible. Madam President, instead of empty words, Democrats want to see action, and that is why we just tried to pass the Access to Family Building Act. It doesn't get any more straightforward than that. And yet, just now, Republicans blocked the bill and showed their true colors when it comes to IVF. I am frustrated, Madam President, but I am not done fighting, because I know Americans are watching and they will not forget who's standing with families in Alabama and across the country and who is standing in their way. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
As part of what we're doing here today, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak for up to 5 minutes each prior to the scheduled votes. Myself, Senator Kaine, Senator Warren, and Wyden.
Without objection.
Thank you. You know, I've been really awed and humbled by the eloquence of the women senators who have preceded me, and I hesitate to add to what they've stated so powerfully already, but of course, I'm a man, and this bill is about women's reproductive care and women's rights, but it is also about the rights of all of us. The name of the act is the Access to Family Building Act. It's about families. It's about men like myself whose most awesome moment in life was the time they held their newly born child. Men have an equal stake in the issue that brings us here today. Men should be as scared and angry as women are about this trend, which is so destructive to basic rights and liberties. Women's rights are human rights. The rights at stake here are rights that are American. What could be more American than wanting to bring a child into the world? And what could be more heartbreaking? We've all been through it, through friends, neighbors, maybe our own family. Man and woman in love, wanted to have a child, miscarriages, other obstacles that prevent it. And there is a hole in their hearts, a hole in their homes and their families as they struggle with issues of fertility and childbirth. This measure very simply guarantees the right for women and families everywhere, in Alabama, in Connecticut, in every state in this country, to access the fertility care they need to bring children into the world. You know, over 3 years ago, before Dobbs was decided, and we never could have imagined that Roe v. Wade would be overturned and the Republican Party eviscerated access to abortion care, I posed what I thought was a really easy question to a Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. I asked, is it constitutional to criminalize IVF treatment? She dodged, she ducked, she refused to answer. I thought it was self-evident. It is not constitutional to criminalize IVF treatment. That was before Dobbs. That was before the legal landscape was volcanically uprooted by this Supreme Court which has been captured by a far-right fringe. Some may have wondered why, at that time, I asked what seemed like a very far-fetched, abstruse, arcane question. A lot of people probably didn't even know what it meant. And they may have also wondered why Justice Barrett refused to answer such an obvious question with such a self-evident answer. Wasn't it settled that IVF treatment is not only legally protected, but also a scientific miracle? Think of it for a moment. The science here that is now accessible to every American, everyone in the world. And wasn't IVF pro-family, having children, parents who wanted a child? And they may have wondered as well, wasn't IVF the last best hope for so many people struggling with infertility, desperately seeking to experience the miracle of childbirth for themselves? Who could possibly object to that miracle in the lives of a family who would not only relish but raise a child to contribute to our great country? What has become devastatingly and tragically clear is that the Republican Party's animosity towards women's health and women's rights doesn't stop at abortion. It's why I asked that IVF question in 2020, and it's why I didn't get a clear answer from a Republican nominee to the Supreme Court. The war on women and on reproductive choices by women and the war on families hasn't stopped at abortion or even IVF.
Senator, your time is up.
So I conclude by thanking my colleagues who have brought this measure to the floor, particularly Senator Duckworth, and I regret that Republicans have blocked this measure. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, the first child born in vitro in the United States is Elizabeth Carr, and she was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1981. Elizabeth's parents were Massachusetts residents, and they struggled with infertility, and their dream was to have a child. And yet it was not to be until they heard about a husband and wife team, Walter and Georgianne Jones, who had been reproductive physicians at Johns Hopkins and then went to England to train with the early pioneer of in vitro fertilization. And they came back to the United States wanting to open a clinic to help couples dealing with fertility issues. And it must have been a hard road for them to find a place that said yes, because this seemed like science fiction at the time. But the Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk said, open a fertility clinic here. I remember I was 23 years old then, and in my memory there was something about it like on the cover of Newsweek. I've gone back and realized, no, it was Life magazine. Because it seemed like science fiction. The science is so hard to even wrap your head around, and yet the Carrs heard about this and they started to travel. They were not people with much money. They started to travel to Norfolk and became patients of the two doctors, Jones, and their daughter Elizabeth was born in Virginia in 1981. She's 43 years old today. She's raising her own family today. Elizabeth has been followed, wrap your head around this, what seemed like unimaginable science fiction in 1981, there are now, by best estimates, 12 million people walking this planet who were born by IVF, living their lives, being happy, raising families, contributing to their communities. 12 million people. What could be more pro-life than in vitro fertilization? 12 million people. Elizabeth was interviewed 2 days ago by WBUR, a public radio station, television station in Boston, and here's what she said. She talked about her life and what she's doing, and then she said this very chillingly: for the first time in my life, I feel like an endangered species. I feel like an endangered species. I think many of us believed that the Dobbs decision, and we made predictions about it, was not fundamentally about pro-life, it was about control. It's about control of women's decisions with respect to abortion, with respect to contraception, and now with respect to deciding there's a path out of infertility. I can have a child. No, we want to control that too. That's what the Alabama Supreme Court has done. That's what Dobbs was about. And that's why I'm proud to sign on to the bill led by Senator Duckworth, the Access to Family Building Act. It's as simple a bill as can be. Healthcare providers have a right to provide fertility treatment, including in vitro services. Patients have a right to access fertility treatment, including in vitro fertilization services. This is not a mandate. The enforcement provisions are provisions that allow a person or a healthcare provider to bring action against a state or governmental entity that tries to interfere with the right that they have. No state should interfere with this right, none. And this is a very simple bill that would enable the Elizabeth Carrs of the world to continue to be born and to continue live happy and productive lives. I'm so glad to be a co-sponsor, and Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, just now my friend and colleague, Senator Tammy Duckworth, a longtime champion for IVF and a longtime champion for families, put forward an important bill that would ensure that families have access to the services they need to have a baby, including IVF. Since then, Republicans have blocked this bill to protect IVF. Now remember that, for all of their talk about supporting IVF, when it came down to it, right here in this chamber, Republicans blocked IVF protection. Republican opposition to IVF is terrifying. It makes me furious, but it should not surprise anyone. Donald Trump set the stage for the attacks on reproductive rights when he stacked the Supreme Court with ultra-conservative justices and overturned Roe versus Wade. And since then, Republicans banned or severely restricted abortion in 24 states. They're trying to ban medication abortion nationwide. And now in Alabama, these extremists have virtually outlawed IVF, fertility care that gives people a chance to start a family. This has always been about conservative politicians controlling women's bodies. This has been Donald Trump and the Republicans' plan all along. And the opposition to Senator Duckworth's proposal today shows that Republicans are doubling down against reproductive freedom. They are coming for medication abortion. They are coming for birth control, and they are even coming for prenatal care. Make no mistake, we will fight them every step of the way. I want to talk for just a minute about the people who are affected by these extremist policies. Families in Alabama who have been wanting and praying that IVF can help them have a baby. Women who have injected themselves with medication for weeks or months or even years. People who have spent an entire life savings trying to start a family, only now to see their hopes go down the drain. LGBTQ families who have spent years taking on every obstacle just for the chance to have a baby of their own. And for some, this was the last chance. And now, Republicans like Donald Trump and those in this chamber might try to backtrack, might try to say that they are working to protect IVF. But it's all talk. Senate Republicans' actions today speak louder than any empty promises they make. Americans can tell when Republican politicians try to talk out of both sides of their mouths. The American people want reproductive freedom. The American people support parents and those desperately trying to become parents. So here's what comes next. Democrats have made clear that we stand with President Biden, with Vice President Harris, and with the millions of families affected by these heartless policies. We stand to protect reproductive rights for people all across this country. And together, we will fight for every person to have access to a safe abortion. We will fight for every family to have access to the services needed to have a baby. And we won't stop fighting until we secure the Congress that we need to protect reproductive freedom for everyone in this country. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of Senator Duckworth's bill, and together, we're going to get this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, I want to say to my colleague from Illinois, I am so proud to be a supporter of your legislation that is going to provide the necessary protections for women in America to become mothers. And I think I mentioned this to my colleague at lunch a couple of days ago. 30 years ago, Madam President, I wrote the Fertility Clinic Success Rate and Certification Act into law. And I would just say to my colleague, back then, we never thought we'd have to be standing today on the floor of the United States Senate debating this as we are today. But we are here because a few days ago, Alabama's far-right Supreme Court handed down a first-of-its-kind ruling, effectively making IVF impossible in Alabama. So, we're seeing heartbreaking headlines about couples in that state being forced to rethink their plans to start a family through the IVF process that was just, in effect, getting going back then, 30 years ago. Some of these families have already spent tens of thousands of dollars and have undergone extensive medical treatment. Alabama's largest hospital system, the University of Alabama, has already paused its IVF services out of fear of prosecution. The decision to conceive a child through IVF is rarely ever a parent's first choice. It's physically and emotionally painful and taxing, it's tedious, and it's expensive. But for countless couples dreaming of just one thing, the chance to start a family, the legislation that my colleagues have been working on is absolutely essential. The IVF journey, as we started talking about years ago, for so many parents is grueling, filled with countless doctor's appointments, agonizing waits for test results, and too often, disappointment. The process is very delicate. Embryos can expire at any time during the process entirely by accident. Under Alabama's new ruling, a doctor or a woman undergoing treatment could be charged with wrongful death if an embryo expires during the IVF transfer or implementation process. That means women who are already undergoing this incredibly painful process could also be handed a wrongful death lawsuit on top of everything else. That, in my view, Madam President and colleagues, is nothing short of criminalizing parents, criminalizing people who try to become parents. Unfortunately, while this ruling is a shocking one, it's not all that surprising if you've been paying attention to the ongoing war that the far right is waging on women and families in America. For years, Republicans laughed off the concerns about the vulnerability of abortion protections under Roe. Then they gutted it at the first opportunity. Since the Dobbs decision, these same Republicans have tried again to convince the American people that there's no threat of a national abortion law and no threat to any other facet of reproductive freedom like contraception. In short, no domino effect. Instead, the repeal of Roe has laid the groundwork for an onslaught of court rulings, just like this one in Alabama, which explicitly references the Dobbs case. The gaslighting would be laughable if it weren't so terrifying. We've all become familiar with the adage, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. At every opportunity, Republicans have moved mountains in order to restrict the constitutional rights and freedoms of women, making it impossible for them to live their lives free from government intrusion. And it's pretty clear to me they're not going to rest until there's a politician in every bedroom and an exam room in America. In the wake of last week's ruling, I saw a lot of my Republican colleagues attempt to distance themselves from the decision, claiming that they unequivocally support IVF. But that's what they put in motion when they overturned Roe versus Wade. In fact, a year ago, Senate Democrats tried to pass Senator Duckworth's bill. Senate Republicans blocked it. So now what is clear, if colleagues really do support IVF, as so many were spending the whole weekend claiming, then they're in luck. They're in luck because Senator Duckworth is going to give them an opportunity to prove it by going on the record and this evening supporting this legislation. And as I say to my friend from Illinois, I was thinking of you coming over here today because back 30 years ago, nobody ever thought we'd have to be out here just trying to get started and making sure families had information. But what you're doing is so incredibly important, Senator Duckworth, because with your legislation in America, we will have the necessary protections for women to become mothers using IVF. I urge my colleagues to strongly support the Duckworth legislation.